Hi guys, this is just a short video to talk you through the main features of Pompeii and Herculaneum streetscapes. So for this dot point, you need to be able to identify things about how the town is planned, about what you would see on a street, and you also need to know some distinguishing features or differences between a Pompeii street and a Herculaneum street. So the reading's pretty detailed. Everything you need to know is in here, but I'll just talk you through it. One of the important key terms for this dot point is insulae. So an insulae is basically the Roman key term for a block. And the whole town is actually influenced by the Greek system, which is a grid. So the whole town is organised in this grid pattern where streets kind of run at right angles to each other. So it's very well planned out. When you walk around, you can kind of figure out where everything is from blocks. So it's not like a confusing mismatch of weaving streets. It's very well planned in this regular layout. So that's a really good thing you can mention in a response straight away, and that is a commonality between the two. The blocks do vary. Pompeii blocks are bigger than Herculaneum's blocks, and the streets are also a fair bit wider in Pompeii, and we see narrower streets in Herculaneum. The reason for this is Pompeii is a busier town. It's got a really big economy with lots of traffic. There'd be trade happening, whereas Herculaneum's a lot smaller. It's more like a resort style town, so things are on a smaller scale there. Some important features about both are that there are walls that are surrounding the towns. So they are originally meant to be defensive stone walls. Most ancient cities did have defensive walls. But when Pompeii became a Roman colony, so Rome colonized the area, the defensive walls kind of lost their importance because Rome was the most powerful empire at the time. So they took away some sections of them, but you can still see parts of the walls. Herculaneum did have a sea wall, so that kind of separates the town from the port. It might have been protective as well. And we have lots of boat houses and boat chambers along that wall, which is important. Gates are an important part of both cities. So city gates are at the end of all of the main streets. So every main street or thoroughfare will lead to a gate. So some of the different gates are the Marine Gate, the Herculaneum Gate. So they've all got different names. You don't need to know all of them. It might be good to have one example up your sleeve, but the gates are at the end of all of the main roads. So streets and roads in Pompeii show how advanced they were for the time. So it shows that Romans were quite skilled in this area. They had these paving techniques where they used these blocks that were raised, almost like making a footpath. You can see it in this picture here. So this main part of the road's here, and then there's a raised curb. Now, I know that that seems pretty standard, but at the time, that's actually quite progressive. It's showing that they had an understanding of how sewage systems work, that they wanted to make sure that things didn't overflow when it rained. So it is quite advanced. Having curbing is not a typical feature of an ancient road. Stepping stones are also a clue that they were quite advanced for the time. So if you have a look down here at this picture, source B, in Pompeii, we've got the road here, we've got the raised curbing for people, pedestrians to walk, and if they wanted to cross the road, there's actually these stepping stones here. So if it was a rainy day, they're actually not having to step down in this wet area, they can sort of cross the road. And the stepping stones also allow for traffic. So wheeled carts could go either side of the stepping stones as well. So it's pretty clever technology. So pedestrian stepping stones, but still giving access to wheeled traffic. What else do we need to talk about? yeah, the streets of Herculaneum had less traffic because they're not a busy trading town, they're smaller. So there's less evidence of these stepping stones and wider streets in Herculaneum. Now, another big clue that Pompeii was a bustling, busy town full of trade is actually these deep wheel ruts. You can see them in this road here. We've got the curb and the road, and there's these two indents here, which is actually just wear and tear on the road over time from the wheels of heavy carts. So the evidence of these wheel ruts is the biggest clue that Pompeii was a really busy town because it has heavy traffic. Whereas in Herculaneum, we actually don't have any wheel ruts. That's a big difference. So Pompeii streets, you'll see evidence of heavy traffic. Herculaneum, you won't see this. So that's a big difference between the two. Okay, down here you can see a nymphaea. Now, nymphaea is the correct key term for a fountain. It's named after a nymph, which is like a little water spirit or mythical creature. And you see a lot of nymphaea or fountains on the corners of a lot of the busy streets. And they were pretty advanced actually. They connected to the aqueduct, so they had fresh water running through them. It was clean enough to drink. So a very advanced system. All right, one of the other things that you might like to put in your notes is that the streets are all sort of now modern Italian names. Romans probably had different names for them. But the main thing that we need to know is that via stands for like a main highway or a main road. So I want you to remember this one. You should put this in your notes. The main road, the most popular busy road in Pompeii is called the Via, which means road, the Via dell'Abbondanza. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but try and remember that one as an example, as a name of a busy street. So it's one of the principal roads, the Via dell'Abbondanza, and that's one of the ones that Spinazzola spent a lot of time excavating. Now, these two key terms we're going to talk about, decumani and cardines, you don't have to remember these. This would be the kind of detail you'd want to remember if you're aiming for a band 6 in the HSC. It's extra detail. Basically, when we have our grid system in Pompeii and Herculaneum, so the insulae is the whole block. Okay, so one block is an insulae, but the actual roads have specific names. So decumani are the roads running east to west. So this one here, east, west. Okay, so they would sit horizontal. So decumani is any road running east to west, whereas a cardine is any road going north to south. So they go vertically. And they meet at right angles, and that forms the insulae or the block. And like I said, this is normally where a nymphaea would go. So a fountain would go on the corner of a block. So that's kind of the layout or the site plan of both towns. So if you wanted to add those extra key terms, you can. Apparently there's Roman legislation. From what we know about ancient Rome, and because these are both Roman colonies, streets actually had to be a minimum of 5 meters wide. So at Pompeii, all of the streets are at least 5 meters wide. But at Herculaneum, some of the streets are quite narrow. They're smaller, only half that of 2.5 meters wide, whereas some are 7 meters. It just depends what part of the town it's in. In the more busier parts where the more expensive homes are, we have bigger, wider streets, whereas some of them are quite small. So we're not sure why they don't conform to that. Maybe because the towns were built before Rome colonized them, so they didn't actually meet that legislation. But the main point is Pompeii is a bigger city. It's got wider streets. It's got evidence of heavier traffic. Whereas Herculaneum is designed as a smaller town with not going to meet the needs of trade and commerce and all those things. Okay, When we learn about government, we'll learn that actually the political figures, the duumvir and the aediles, are responsible for maintaining streets. It's one of their roles. But don't worry too much about that yet, because we'll talk a bit more about it when we do political life. Um, Here's just a little bit of information about how they kind of first interpreted the plan. So when Fiorelli, the very first official superintendent of the site, so he was put in charge by the Italian government, so he kind of introduced the system to locate houses and buildings. So there's no confusion because we used to sort of call houses after what was found in them. So, for example, the house of the chaste lovers, because two people were found there. So that we kind of used to name them after what was found in a descriptive way. But Fiorelli kind of introduced this new system where each doorway in an insulae is given a number, so that instead of calling things the House of Julia Felix, which we still do use, I mean, that we know that because her name's on the front of the home, so we call it the House of Julia Felix, but for recording purposes, he changed that to become 2, so that'd be like insulae 2, house number 4, doorway number 2, so that sort of thing. But that's not too important. That's just some later advancements. This is the stuff that should be going in your notes that we talked about up here. So what you might do is you might add the key terms insulae, nymphaea, decumani, cardines to your glossary. You might make a few points about some common features that they both had, like walls, gates, those sort of things. Curbing, and then you might list some differences as well, like Pompeii has evidence of wider streets and some traffic, whereas Herculaneum's are a little bit narrower. The only other thing I forgot to mention actually is if you ever see a picture of a streetscape that's a double story like this one, and it also has the timber balcony, so you can see the timber balcony here. We know that this comes from Herculaneum because of the different effects of the eruption. So remember in Pompeii, in the earlier stages of the eruption, when the ash and everything was falling on the city, this upper story probably would have collapsed. It would have been damaged and it would have been collapsed. But because Herculaneum missed all of that and they just got the surges, it kind of preserved all of this timber perfectly and it wasn't destroyed in the earlier phases. So we see double-story homes and timber work in Herculaneum, but we would never find any evidence of timber in Pompeii because it's been damaged by the ash and burnt in the fires early on. So that's one thing that Herculaneum gives us insight into. It doesn't mean that Pompeii didn't have double stories and it didn't have timber work. It's just been destroyed, so we can't observe that. All right, I hope that helped you make your notes, and if you have any questions, just ask. Thanks, guys.